Tremors is a franchise that spans 7 movies and an entire TV series, and none of it would be possible without the creatures we are talking about today, the Graboids. So, to call these things giant worms is actually truly an understatement. They have one of the weirdest life cycles of any movie monster, and I want to try and walk you through each stage in their life cycle, as well as look at their history and try to explain exactly what they are. So looking at them, you would think they can't be naturally occurring creatures, but they actually are, with the earliest evidence of a graboid egg being a fossil from the Devonian period. This actually makes them one of the oldest life forms on Earth. Now, admittingly, they were probably doing a lot of swimming back then, and were probably not very big, or at least not as big as they are in the modern day. They're also technically not worms. They look like worms, but they are actually cephalopods, more like big squids, weirdest squids ever, but squids. So, oldest creatures on the planet, how did they get into the modern day? Well, the answer is their life cycle. All graboids come from eggs, and the eggs have an exceptionally long hatching cycle. We don't know what the exact timing of the hatching cycle is, but we do know that the environment plays a role in their hatching, specifically an outside heat source, and a graboid egg can actually lie dormant for a long time, 300 years being the longest we know about, but it could actually be longer if the environmental factors aren't right. This has not only enabled them to survive into the modern day, but also remain hidden in the modern day. The environment can also cause eggs to hatch a lot sooner, like from geothermal activity, hot springs, or even if the eggs are exposed to radiation or human construction. And also, hidden might not be the best way to describe them, since across human history, we have had run-ins with them. We see cave drawings of graboids in Africa, as well as African tribes hunting what they call lightning birds, which were possibly ass blasters. And Native American tribes call them spirit demons. So the hatching cycles are just far enough apart so that the stories of them fall into myth and legend, but we have had run-ins with them over the centuries. So that's pretty much their history. Now let's take a look at their entire life cycle of the graboid. I already mentioned the whole life cycle starts with an egg, and once the egg hatches, it turns into what is called a dirt dragon. The best way to describe them is a mini graboid, but there are some differences. Clearly, they're significantly smaller, about 3 to 5 feet long. Their head has a beak made up of 4 mandibles that can open up. They have bony spikes all the way down their bodies, and their main body looks like really fleshy, but is actually 2 very sturdy plates, probably a repurposed shell. And they have no eyes. Due to their small size, they are extremely fast, traveling about 30 miles an hour underground, and their main form of hunting is launching themselves out of the dirt to attack their prey. This earned them another name, being called shooters, because it's like they shoot out of the ground. Also, if they hatch out in a group, they will all hunt together, showing just as much intelligence as the adults. A unique ability this form has from the adults is that they can burrow into the ground vertically by vibrating, essentially creating quicksand and sinking into the ground with their victim. Now, they don't remain in this stage very long, basically aggressively feeding for about 3 months before shedding their protective plates and spines. Then they go into a semi-dormant state where they don't move or hunt a lot, pouring all their energy into rapid growth and moving on to the next stage of their life cycle, the graboid. So here's where things are going to get fun, because there are 4 species of graboids, all being unique, and they're also all different from each other. So I'm just going to tackle each species in the order we're introduced to them. I think that's just the easiest way to cover this. Starting with the American species. These are roughly 30 feet long and 6 feet in circumference. Like their dirt dragons, they have a beak made up of 4 mandibles, although they are much longer. Like all of their stages, they also have no eyes. They no longer have the protective plates or spikes. Instead, they are supported by a semi-rigid framework like cuttlefish, and they have smaller spines all along their body, which, when combined with their musculature, allows them to move through the ground. It also allows them to sense vibrations, to hunt down their prey, and communicate with other members of their group. They also have 3 10-foot-long tentacles inside of their mouths that, when not in use, will retract into their throat. The end of the tentacles are in the shape of a head and mouth with teeth for grabbing, and what looks like horns on the back of the head. The tentacles are full of receptors used for exploring their environment and assessing potential prey. Graboids are exceptionally strong and can travel through the ground at 15 to 20 miles per hour. So a little slower than the dragon, so a little bit slower than the dragon. They cannot travel through solid rock, as I said previously. They will also work together and are smart enough to hold grudges and set traps. They are even able to communicate with clicks and echolocation. Also, the graboid species and stages blood is orange, not super vital information, but it is a good segue into the fact that within almost every graboid is 3 other creatures. And the easiest way to understand this is basically this is an extreme version of a parasitic twin. After a graboid has been, well, a graboid for an unknown period of time, possibly determined by the amount of available food, it will come to the surface, essentially beaching itself. This will trigger the parasites to start to come out, essentially eating their way out of the graboid violently. Thus, you get 3 shriekers. Now, the shriekers are the most drastic change we've seen so far. Shriekers are only about 4 feet long and 3 feet tall. They keep the same overall shape of the graboid head, except the top of the head. They have these heat detecting organs that allow them to track their prey through heat signatures, as well as communicate with one another. Their body is really stumpy, but also very muscular, and they now have 2 muscular legs with claws on the end of them. Instead of the 3 tentacles of the graboid, shriekers only have 1 in their mouth that they will drag around the ground to find food, which they also do by hunting down prey in packs. Like graboids, they have great problem-solving skills. For instance, when the humans were hiding from them on a roof, they start to build a ladder essentially by standing on top of one another to get to the humans. Another interesting thing about shriekers is that they can make more shriekers. See, shriekers only live for about 12 hours, and all they do is eat. But once they have eaten enough, they essentially barf up another baby shrieker, which rapidly grows to adult size and starts the process all over again. This could be one of 2 things. Straight up parthenogenesis, basically using the calories from their food to clone themselves each time, or possibly they also have some level of parasitic twin that develops inside of them, kind of like the graboids do. It's never really explained how this kind of works out. But in my opinion, this stage is the most dangerous stage of the entire life cycle. With the speed, power, mobility, and the ability to duplicate themselves, shriekers can really get out of control fast. A good example of this is when a group of shriekers managed to eat an entire truckload of chickens, and Bert had to mow down an entire army of them. But as I said, they are only shriekers for about 12 hours. Their entire job is essentially build up the population members for the next stage. But basically, at the end of its time, a shrieker will once again go through a type of metamorphosis and will essentially molt its body, turning it into a ass blaster. Ass blasters are the final stage in the life cycle. Ass blasters are smaller than shriekers. They're really lean, have long necks, and the beak actually has the most dramatic change, growing more slender and turning a dark black. Their legs get skinnier, basically a bit more bird-like, and they retain the heat sensing organs, although it is smaller on set. Ass blasters also don't have tentacles in their throat. Along their sides and back, they have pink fleshy fins that are retractable that they can use for their most defining characteristic, which is gliding. Located in the ass of an ass blaster are special organs that produce highly combustible chemicals that they will mix together by shaking their butts, and when they release will cause a mini explosion that will essentially launch them into the air, where they will use their fins to glide. Combine that with their heat-seeking abilities to attack from the air, the flames produced are extremely hot, and they can actually channel them into a more concentrated blast that can cut through the door to a safe room. They're also just as intelligent as the shriekers and will actually work in packs from the air. So now we have to ask the question of why they developed the ability to fly in the first place. And the answer to that is actually simple: reproduction. So basically an ass blaster's role is to fly as far away from the original location and lay 1 graboid egg, usually after doing some hunting around the area, since they usually seem to stay in the area for at least a few days before they fly off. However, if one eats too much, it will actually fall asleep, unlike the shriekers who will just reproduce another shriek. Believe it or not, this is not all that uncommon in the real world. If lions make a kill, they will actually spend a lot of time just sleeping and digesting their prey. Now, we really don't know what happens to them after they lay the eggs. We know that they tend to lay them together if there are multiple ass blasters in a flock, but they will also go off on their own away from their flock and lay a single egg elsewhere. There are a couple of reasons for this. One would be to keep diversity in the gene pool, but we have never really seen them mating, and it is sort of implied through the series that they reproduce asexually, so it's more likely that this is actually only to establish new territories. But we don't know if they die after laying the eggs. Most likely not, based on the other species, but we haven't seen one live to old age in the modern day, so we don't know how long they can actually live for. That's pretty much the full life cycle of the American graboid, and the rest of them are actually going to be pretty similar, but I'll cover the differences as we get there. The one thing I do want to cover is, how do you kill these things? It's not easy, but it's also not as hard as you might think. See, Graboids are intelligent, but you can trick them, which is the most common way of killing them in the series, either by tricking them into swallowing an RC car with bombs attached to it, or by getting them moving at top speed and tricking them off a cliff. Shriekers are less armored and are more susceptible to gunfire, and ass blasters are just flying bombs thanks to the organs that they produce the explosions. So they can actually blow themselves up, or if you hit them with something in the rear, it'll actually cause an explosion, and they also will just end up crash landing. Now, before we move on, I do have to explain one more theory on the Shrieker stage, and that is that they are actually Graboid tentacles. Basically, all of the Graboids have 3 tentacles, and the tentacles are actually an external extension of the parasitic twin, sending signals to the Graboids and helping it find and catch prey. And once they have gained enough nutrients, 3 fully formed Shriekers will emerge from the Graboid. And there is more evidence of this when we get into the next species, but I just thought I'd bring it up here so that way it's a little less out of the blue. So the African species. Now, the African species differs from the American species in a few ways. To start with, they're just bigger, ranging in the size from about 40 to 50 feet. They're also slimmer and more streamlined with the American than the American Graboid. Their spines are more pronounced. They still have a beak, however the bottom part of it is split into 2, giving them 5 appendages as opposed to 4. The species also has an internal skeleton that they independently evolved. The way their musculature is attached, it actually makes them look more like a drill, which is actually a good comparison since unlike the American species, which undulates in order to move under the ground, the African species spins to move underground. And by doing this, they are much faster than the American species, and their preferred method of hunting is to actually chase down their prey, then leap out of the ground, swallow it whole, and then go back underground, kind of like the dirt dragon. They also have a specialized saliva that allows them to move through dense ground and actually some types of rock. But they're just as intelligent as the American species, however, they take their cooperation to a whole new level, and we'll get to that in a second. But first, we need to talk more about the tentacles known as the grabbers. So unlike the American Graboids, the African species tentacles are actually capable of fully detaching from the Graboid. The end of the grabbers are much more armored and bony-like than the American versions, and they move across the ground by slithering like snakes. If we're being honest, they look a lot like Graboids themselves. The scary part is when they open their mouths, they look like the facehuggers from Alien. It has 6 protrusions with spikes on it that they use to grab onto their prey. They also have a throat full of teeth. Even though they are autonomous, the Graboid can actually still use them in the same ways the American Graboid uses them. However, since they're autonomous, the African species will use them to essentially go to where it can't in order to get prey, which they do effectively, although we're not sure exactly how they get the prey back to the Graboid. They definitely kill whatever the prey is, but we don't know if they drag it back to the Graboid or if they lead the Graboid to it after they've killed it. Here's where you would think you could move on to the next stage, except we actually never see the African Shriekers. Or did we? See, the prevailing theory is that the grabbers are actually the Shrieker stage of the African Graboid. Just instead of growing larger and getting legs, they remain more serpentine and work with the Graboid. And this is why I mentioned this a little bit sooner. And this actually adds to the theory that I mentioned earlier that the tentacles of the American Graboid are actually what turn into the Shriekers. There is another theory, but it's easier to explain than talking about their behaviors. So again, stay tuned. But this is a great segue to talk about the Ass Blaster stage, since this is some more evidence supporting the grabbers and our Shrieker theory there as well. So the African Ass Blaster is very different from the American Ass Blasters. First off, they are huge, being taller than most humans. However, they are a lot less streamlined, being more of a cylinder-like shape. They have sort of a tail that is also cylindrical to better channel the explosions, and they're much spikier. They also have actual wings that fold up, even though they are only able to glide. Even so, they're better at taking off and prolonged flight. Then there's the face, which is just one big mouthful of teeth, surrounded by 6 spiky protrusions. It looks almost exactly like the grabbers, and is a contributing factor to the previously talked about theory, since the face looks more like the grabbers than the graboids. They also lack visible heat-seeking organs, but they can see heat, which they actually use to hunt at night, being entirely nocturnal. So we need to talk about their overall behavior, which is highly sociable across the different life stages. See, the African species is extremely dedicated to the continuation of the bloodline, unlike the American species, which gives no care once their eggs are laid. Both are valid strategies in nature, however, I believe this behavior in the African species is a result of local tribes hunting them to their extinction. So essentially, the ass blasters will all lay their eggs in communal clutches in caves. They then stay in the area and guard the eggs. However, to assist them, there will be a queen graboid. The queen differs from other graboids in that they remain a graboid, never spawning a second stage, and they will coordinate the ass blasters for hunting and protection, guarding the nest during the day, and can track down eggs if they are stolen. Though admittingly, the ass blasters might also be able to do that, but essentially everything we see them do is to continue the bloodline. However, this could also just be an extreme case, since it would seem that the group we see are the last of their kind, but this is the trend with the other species we can talk about as well, so the American species might just be the odd ones out. But they are also the most different of all of the species we see, so that would also make some level of sense. And real quick, before we move on to the Arctic species, I do want to go over the theory when it comes to the streaker stage of the African graboids. So first off, a graboid not spawning streakers was not necessarily a new thing. El Blanco and albino North American graboid never spawned streakers, and the prevailing theory is it was because of his albinism. So this does actually set a precedent for the queens in other species. However, the African queens are still unique with the grabbers. So the other theory is that the other graboids still spawn shriekers that eventually turn into the ass blasters, still just 3 and tied to the tentacles. However, when a queen graboid develops, at least in this species, the shriekers developing inside of her will become the more snake-like grabbers. So it could go one of both ways, and the queens are just individually different from the rest of them. But now finally, we can move on to the Arctic species. And I'll save us some time here. The Arctic species overall looks a lot like the African species, with a more bluish color, with a few similarities to the American species, but that is mostly internal and behavioral. For instance, there doesn't really appear to be any evidence of them working with the ass blasters, but they do coordinate the groups among the graboids. They also move by spinning and hunting by breaching out of the ground. We also see that they guard their nest like the African species. There may or may not be a queen. We've only seen one at the nest, but it's never stated it was a queen. We found out this is because the Arctic species is actually the oldest surviving species and was probably the progenitor of the American and the African species, which I guess makes sense, except Bert said that the African species seemed older and more evolved than the American species. So I guess it's possible the African species diverged first, and possibly through the human conflict evolved behaviorally, and the American species diverged even more in appearance. I really don't have much of an answer for you there. It's just kind of, they say it, this is the older of those 3 species. And honestly, the real world answer is they just used the same models from bloodlines and then just made it where the snakes didn't come out of their mouths. We also don't see any streakers with this species, and though their tentacles look like the African species, they don't detach from the graboid like the American species. Then there's the ass blasters, which also look pretty much the same as the African species, again with a more bluish coloring. And like I already said, it doesn't work for a queen. However, we do know that they lay their eggs directly into hot springs to incubate them, but they are the best flyers we see of any ass blaster actually being capable of sustained flight. That's really it to the Arctic species. The biggest takeaway here is that they are the progenitors of the other 2 species, proven when they use venom from the Arctic graboid to essentially create anti-venom for the parasite that Bert got when he was inside of an American graboid. But finally, we can look at the oceanic species. Technically, this graboid isn't naturally occurring. Bill, the owner of Avix Biotech, genetically bred and modified them to make them stronger and more intelligent so that way he could hunt them. So these graboids are kind of a mixed bag. They look and move more like the African and Arctic species, except they have tufts of hair on their head, as well as an exoskeleton. But the big thing that separates them is that they can swim, with the ones we see moving from island to island. Now, we've seen the Arctic species in a hot spring before, and water has always been tied to the overall graboid life cycle, but this is the first evidence we have of them actually swimming. Now, there's no real reason the other graboids couldn't swim, we just don't really see them do it. And there are the grabbers, which, like the Arctic species, don't actually detach from their throats. So, it's a man-made monster is what this is. Now, unlike the other two species we spoke about, these actually do spawn shriekers that we actually do get to see. And we didn't actually get to see the ass blaster stage, so this is the second stage we get to see. These shriekers are actually more terrifying than the American shriekers though. Their overall shape is similar to the North American shriekers, but they are covered in a bony exoskeleton, and probably because of this, their heat-seeking organs are actually always exposed. Their tongues are also spikier than the American shriekers. They're also more intelligent and hunt in groups like they do, but they have more of an effect because they actually have another ability that sets them apart in that they can combine their screeches into a sonic weapon that immobilizes their prey, allowing them to pretty much pick them off at their leisure. And probably a good thing we never made it all the way to the ass blaster stage, because if the ass blasters could do that from the air, we're pretty much screwed. But I actually believe that is everything there is to know about the history and the life cycles of the graboids from Tremors. Please leave a comment down below which monster you would like for me to cover next. And while you guys are down there, please remember to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, turn on that notification bell, and I'll see you guys in the next video.